The Shroud of Turin, very controversial shroud that has lots and lots of people talking, and many Christians are starting to realize that this is indeed the birth the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So today I'm with one of those Christians, Dale of Real Seekers, and we're going to explore more on the Shroud of Turin. So let me go ahead and just turn it over to Dale.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's you're right that it's the Shroud of Turin. I've noticed in the last few years has been picking up in popularity, and people capturing Christianities, doing shows on it. Unbelievable did a show a while back. I myself was on the Reason and Theology podcast recently, where I kind of convinced them. So yeah, it's gaining steam, and I think that's great. Obviously, I'm a guest on your show as well, so. Yeah, just to kind of recap. So I've been kind of doing a series looking at looking at the science and then doing a history topic. And in the science part, we've been looking at the various image forming mechanisms. So we kind of looked at the proto-photo hypothesis first of Nicholas Allen. We saw that the shroud is not a medieval photograph. And then last time I looked at the historicity. So Shroud skeptics claim that another claim is that the shroud is just a medieval painting. And I first addressed and refuted that historically with the Darcy Memorandum. That was our last episode. This episode, I want to look at the traditional painting hypothesis from a scientific perspective. So on that front, I will share my screen to do my little presentation. This one will probably be a little technical, so I apologize for that. It's just the nature of it, but let me know if that's popping up for you.
I can see it.
All right, awesome. Okay, so in terms of image forming hypotheses, remember there are three categories of mechanisms. So there are ordinary artistic mechanisms, whereby medieval artists or craftsmen manufactured the shroud images in the medieval period. So far, those are the ones we've looked at. The proto-photo hypothesis is an ordinary artistic mechanism, and obviously the painting one is as well. There's also ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, which we're going to be looking at, things like direct contact or gas diffusion, stuff like that, where it's a dead body, presumably Jesus, is put in the shroud and nature takes over and produces the images in some natural way. And then finally, we have the ones that I like, and I'm going to be arguing for eventually through this series, is our extraordinary or supernatural mechanisms, things like some kind of radiation or electrostatic mechanisms. For example, Giulio Fonte just published his book on the divine photography hypothesis. Okay, so cool. So these are what we've done so far. So the last one we looked at was Nicholas Allen's proto-photo hypothesis. Perhaps for the next one, I'll look at the shadow hypothesis of Nathan Wilson. But for today, we're looking at this guy, Walter McCrone, and his traditional painting hypothesis. So what is this hypothesis? So essentially, the traditional painting hypothesis is the oldest shroud skeptical image forming hypothesis, right? This was the first proposed in 1389 by Bishop Pierre Darcy. Remember, we looked at his memorandum last time, and he claimed that an artist supposedly confessed during an inquiry or an investigation in the 1350s and said, yes, I was the one who painted the shroud images. It's just a fake, and they're just trying to gain money. And we refuted that historical evidence. But today I want to turn to the scientific evidence for and against the painting hypothesis, primarily looking at Stirp's data and conclusions versus Walter McCrone. And in terms of the Stirp scientists, they used dozens or thousands of tests, like dozens of spectral tests, various microchemical, chemical, and physical or optical experiments. They tested the cloth for all known organic and or inorganic pigments, paints, or dyes, and they didn't find any evidence for the body images or bloodstains being composed of these kinds of materials. Furthermore, their results were published in about more than 24, 26 or so secular peer-reviewed journals. We're talking about things like Applied Optics, right? The most prestigious science journals in existence today and at the time. And in the words of the STIRP scientists, their final conclusion was, quote unquote, the fibers are only colored, that straw, talking about the body images, that straw yellow brown image, due to chemical reactions involving the polysaccharides composing the linen fibers themselves. It's a chemical reaction, basically meaning it's oxidation. When you put a newspaper out in the sun for a few days, it turns that yellow color over time from the UV radiation. That's essentially what the yellow color is of the body images, according to STIRP. It's dehydration or oxidation of the cellulose itself. And they say colored linen fibers are only colored due to a chemical reaction involving these fibers. There is no evidence of a coating or an extraneous material added to the fibers to cause the body image color. Okay, enter Walter McCrone, the ultimate shroud skeptic, and he totally disagrees, right? So he was a famous or infamous, I would rather say, microscopist who kind of first became famous in the 1970s. And his main claim to fame was really about two public declarations that he pronounced were false related to two famous artifacts. So number one, that obviously is the Shroud of Turin. He said that's just a painting, that's a fake. But also the Vinland map. And it's important to note that he's been discredited and totally falsified on both accounts, not just with the Shroud of Turin, but scholars also mock his conclusions regarding the so-called Vinland map about the Vikings and that sort of thing. So yeah, he's been very shoddy in his work and scientific conclusions. Anyway, so he was not officially a part of STIRP. There is confusion about that. He never officially joined the team, nor did he ever study the shroud in person using instruments. He went to Turin with his wife as a tourist, and he saw the shroud in person as a tourist, but he was never scientifically examining the shroud in person in detail up close, like the STIRP team members were. Instead, he was merely given certain shroud samples from Ray Rogers that he studied under his polarized light microscope. And basically, like I said, he concluded, in contradiction to STIRP, that the images had been painted. He found evidence, supposedly, of an iron oxide-based pigment or red ochre pigment in a gelatin-binding medium known as a tempera collagen watercolor paint or pigment. And subsequently, he also claimed that the bloodstains were touched up later on with a red vermilion pigment. So that corresponds to finding mercury sulfide, I believe it is. Now, despite his death in 2002, you'll still hear shroud skeptics on the internet quoting his findings as proof that the shroud is a painting. I laugh because I was on the Pine Creek Doug show, and he's so ignorant. He was still appealing to Walter McCrone's findings, thinking that this proved the shroud was painted. And let's just say he found out the hard way that's not true. But yeah, so you'll still hear some shroud skeptics who are not really up to date spouting the McCrone's stuff here.
So so are you going to explain how they decided to discredit it exactly?
Yeah, that's what this show is going to be about. I'm going to go into explicit details. So yeah, I'll try not to bore you with that, but okay, cool. So let's get into an assessment then, right? We have these two contradictory claims. We have STIRP saying it's not paint. There's no paint making up the images, and Walter McCrone claiming the opposite. Who's correct? Well, in order to assess that, I like to have my minimal relevant features approach, as you'll remember. So the first thing we have to do is look at the facts, and then we have to use our methodology to evaluate the traditional painting hypothesis as an explanation. So with my minimal relevant features, just by way of reminder, I only include features that are highly evidenced and substantiated in the credible peer-reviewed science literature, and at least 2/3 of the informed experts accept the feature as a proven fact. In terms of methodology, we're going to be assessing how does the painting hypothesis account for each of these facts or features, and then assess it in terms of its plausibility. How does it cohere with our background knowledge? The explanatory scope, how many of the minimal relevant features is it able to explain? Explanatory power is looking at how well does it explain it? do so with any ambiguity or vagueness, stuff like that. And then finally, simplicity. Does it employ any non-evidenced assumptions? And let me just hide this. Okay, so that's how we're going to assess it. So just a quick reminder, what are some of the facts that we're going to be using? So if you remember from last time, we had the negativity. So that's the black and white photos. The shroud's lights and darks are reversed. Body image uniformity. So each individual fibril is colored individually and in a uniform manner. The intensity of color is the exact same on each individual fibril. It's also got the three-dimensional information or topographical information. It has the vertically collimated encodation path. Remember, it's whatever encodation mechanism was at work, it went in straight vertical lines to the cloth. It didn't go out or, different paths and that sort of thing. It's strictly vertically collimated. And then finally, body image superficiality, where the body image color is only on the superficial layers, the top 2 to 3 fibrils. And on each fibril, the size of a human hair, diameter of a human hair, only the primary cell wall, 0.2 micrometers of each fibril. Also in terms of bloodstain properties, there are no body images underneath the bloodstains or the serum retraction rings, and there's no evident smearing, alteration, or damage, even on a microscopic level. And then finally, also, as I said, STIRP proved there is no paint, pigments, or dyes composing the body images or bloodstain images. Okay,
so let me just break in there for a second. When you mentioned the blood stain, I think we should point out, weren't they able to tell what type of blood was it? So it's not like it's a paint that's looking red. Instead, it was a very dark color because of the bilirubin that he had been tortured, and also that they could tell it was AB.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be covering the how they proved it's bloodstains, but that's a great point for a future thing, and I'll confirm they've proven beyond all reasonable doubt that the bloodstains are composed of blood, and they found various components of blood that cumulatively cannot be explained by any paint or pigment, especially the pigments that Walter McCrone suggests, right? They've got hemoglobin, they've got various antibodies that have been found and that sort of thing, various components, bilirubin, porphyrins. Now, the bilirubin, in terms of why the bloodstains are still red, there have been various explanations to explain that, right? So, number one, Giulio Fonte actually does suggest maybe they did touch it up with paint. That's very controversial, and STIRP disagrees with Giulio Fonte, but he's a pro-shroud expert himself. There's also the one you mentioned by Al Adler, who was a porphyrin blood expert. He suggested the bilirubin is what contributed to the ongoing redness of the shroud's bloodstains. Now, that's controversial. Kelly Kearse has written a paper more recently refuting that and saying actually that wouldn't work. So there have been other natural and supernatural explanations for the redness. And I think Alan Adler's suggestion is still on the table, is still viable and plausible, just regardless of Kelly Kearse's attacks. There are other experiments that have been going on using other chemical things that have explained why the shroud is red. My explanation for that is a supernatural one. I think it's because of neutron irradiation. So Paulo de Lazaro has done experiments with ultraviolet irradiation and shown that experimentally does allow for the enduring redness of the stains. I think that it was actually neutron irradiation and then being put out, exposed to ultraviolet radiation in the sun is what explains why the shroud is red. That's my preferred hypothesis, but it's important to note we have at least 4 equally probable, if not more probable, explanations for why the shroud's bloodstains are red that don't entail it being painted or anything like that. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So thank you.
Yep, no problem. And the bilirubin thing is, again, there's a counter paper with Kelly Kearse that you have to take seriously, but it's still viable in my opinion. So you have to look at that. Okay, cool. So let's evaluate the painting hypothesis. As you can see, in terms of the minimal relevant features of the body images, it's horrible. It basically fails every single one. Look, it's physically impossible. When you're using a paintbrush and trying to paint the images, an artist will inevitably apply varying degrees of paint or pressure, and this will result in varying degrees of color intensity being applied to the shroud image, right? So it just fails the body image uniformity aspect. Same with the three dimensionality and the vertically collimated encodation path. This is just number one. An artist would never conceive to paint these features, and it's totally unique in the history of art. No other paintings produce three dimensional images in a VP8 image analyzer, let alone do they have this strict vertically collimated encodation path, right? And believe it or not, Stirp actually did a scientific experiment published in peer-reviewed journals where they used certified forensic artists to try with anchor points to help them recreate these features, and they failed miserably. It was just determined human beings inevitably will fail because they have a limited visual discernment of the shading at low contrast, and they just have inadequate hand-eye brain coordination skills to apply the correct shading values. It is, scientifically speaking, impossible for a traditional painter to create these features with a paintbrush. And that's why every other painting in existence fails when they're plugged into the VP8 image analyzer. Finally, same with superficiality. This, again, a liquid medium like a paint will soak down below the 2 to 3 fibrils in a fiber, in a thread, sorry, and it won't be on the primary cell wall. It'll probably, through capillary flow or action, be evident lower down on the fibril level and be sucked down deep into the paint. And think about it. I mean, look at the bloodstains. They were also supposedly painted. They're entrenched. You see them on the back of the cloth at the fabric level. So you have to come up with some sort of explanation. Why isn't that the case with the body images, but it is with the bloodstains? Also, in terms of negativity, it's questionable, right? Because using traditional painting techniques, it's very interesting that prior to the Shroud of Turin, no artwork in the history of mankind has ever evidenced this body image negativity feature. It's only with the Shroud of Turin and then subsequent painters copying the shroud directly that we get features of negativity coming up. So that one, I gave it best questionable status. Okay, so let's look at the next thing, the minimal relevant feature number 7, the fact that there's no paint on the shroud images. And like I said, various findings have shown there's no paint on the shroud. For example, Barry Schwartz, he was on my show. He has transmitted light photos that prove there's no paint on there. But remember, Walter McCrone claimed the opposite. So what is his basis? On what basis is he saying, no, there are painted images? Well, there are 4 categories of evidence that he found using his microscope and we're going to look at 3 of the 4 that are directly relevant for the pro paint findings, right? So, okay, so the first is that they did indeed find iron and iron oxide on the Shroud of Turin. The second category of evidence that McCrone got is that there were positive tests for proteins in the body image areas, suggesting because every pigment back then had to be in a proteinous gelatin medium, right, to bind the pigment together and apply it. And then 3, various optical properties of the image fibers suggest that there was paint there. So that's where he's looking through his microscope, and there were various things he found. Now, fourthly, there was also tests that tested negative for blood. I'm not going to cover that in this presentation. I will cover it in a future one when it's relevant to prove that there is, in fact, the bloodstains are made of blood. But it's important to note that Walter McCrone also did his own tests for blood, and he claims those came out negative, proving it wasn't blood. If it's not blood, what else is it? He assumed, well, it's got to be paint. I'm going to ignore that in this presentation and just look at the first 3 categories. Okay, cool. So what is the evidences for and against there being paint on the shroud? Well, the first evidence against it is actually from a natural experiment. Back in 1532, there was a massive fire that kind of burned the shroud. We still see these scorches or burn marks right through the shroud today, and that sort of thing, right? So the point here is that, okay, if the shroud images were painted in the 1350s, like McCrone said, using the iron ochre or red ochre or iron oxide pigments and the red vermilion, otherwise known as Venetian rouge, well, think about it. At those scorch marks, if there was a fire, we would see alteration of the paint because paints chemically react when they're under extreme heat, especially near the scorch marks. We would see evident differences and alteration or damage to the painting, right? But guess what? We don't see it. There's no alteration. It's the same. The images are exactly the same right next to the scorch marks as they are far away from the scorch marks. This suggests that it was never painted. It's a falsification. Now, McCrone, of course, he knew this, right? So he actually provided a retort that, quote unquote, well, that's irrelevant because the cloth was folded and this provided a insulation layer. So it was protected. The body images were protected from the heat. That's why we don't see any damage to these painted body images. But again, that is stupid. Remember, we've got the proof that there's from those scorch things burning straight through the cloth and interacting with the body images in certain areas. So that it wouldn't be protected from the heat in those areas, even if it was folded, as McCrone said. And yet there's no alteration. So this just falsifies what McCrone was saying. Furthermore, the shroud was also doused with water to put the fire out, to save the shroud basically at this time. And guess what we don't see? Paints and pigments, there would be runoff or migration of the color if you throw water on a painting and stuff like that. Guess what we see with the shroud? No runoff, no evidence of migration, and that sort of thing. Again, falsifying the Walter McCrone's hypothesis. There was no paint on the shroud at that time. Okay, so let's get into STIRP then, and let's start off with what they did in 1978. And they
Wait, let me cut in here for 1 second, and then we'll go back to STIRP because I've got Captive Desk in the audience, and he says that the A people from Europe and the B people from Asia, those blood types were combined somewhere around the 16th century. Obviously, he's making an assumption that there's been no cross migration between these groups prior to that, which on its face seems pretty absurd. But beyond that, I just want to mention this study. It's called ABO Typing of Ancient Skeletons from Israel. 68 ancient skeletons unearthed at Jerusalem in En Gedi, and according to the archaeological data belonging to Jewish residents of these places from about 1600 to 2000 years ago, were ABO typed by means of the hemagglutination inhibition test. The blood groups of 13 skeletons were undiagnosable, and the remaining 66 showed the following distribution: 30% A group, and I'm rounding up, 15% B group, 51% AB group, and 3.64% O group. So these are ancient skeletons that debunks the assessment that Captive Desk said. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
No problem. So that's that. Again, that's outside of my presentation today. But looking at the blood, that's an interesting fact. I've never heard someone say that before. But that's obviously fake. There have been studies proving that ancient things do come out with AB. That said, I myself am a little skeptical. I don't use it. The fact that we've proven the shroud's blood type is AB as a minimal relevant feature because it's controversial. So one thing is when you have ancient blood and that sort of thing, because it degrades over time, there's a question that all ancient things will come out as AB. So that's an open question right now. And because of that, I don't press the shroud images as being proven to be type AB yet. But that may be true. I just think there needs to be further confirmation on that front. So yeah, fair enough. All right, cool. So the spectral studies on the shroud. So there was dozens of spectral tests. And just to kind of summarize, the first versions of spectral tests were ultraviolet tests, right? So we had ultraviolet fluorescence, ultraviolet reflectance spectroscopy, and ultraviolet microspectroscopy. And guess what was found? And published in the peer-reviewed papers over on shroud.com. You can read them for free yourself. All of the non-image areas fluoresced under ultraviolet, but the body images and bloodstain body images did not fluoresce under ultraviolet illumination. Now, this is incredible because the body images, if they had been painted, there would have been a proteinous gelatin binding medium, and proteins fluoresce under ultraviolet fluorescence, right? That's what the CSI Miami or the crime lab guys use, right? They use ultraviolet fluorescence to find body fluids and blood and stuff like that that have proteins in it. So this is a disproof that the blood stains and the body images were painted because the body images don't fluoresce. Furthermore, they also found those invisible dumbbell-shaped scourge marks, which are invisible to the naked eye, some of them. There was also serum retraction rings, which only appear with blood. As the blood stains clot, they retract and they push out this clear liquid known as serum that kind of yellow over time, and they were only visible with ultraviolet illumination. How could a painter do that with paints? Impossible. They just don't do that. Now, medieval pigment binders contain proteins. I said that. Okay, so yep. And here's just an example of ultraviolet illumination, so you can kind of see with your eyes the scratches that show up that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye. Here's what it looks like again under ultraviolet fluorescence. You can see the serum retraction halos surrounding some of the blood stains there. Okay, okay, perfect. There were also infrared and thermography spectral tests conducted. And guess what it found? Neither vermilion nor iron oxide pigments nor any other pigments were detected in the Shroud of Turin's bloodstain images using these tests, as would be expected if they were created using iron oxide or vermilion pigment. Thermal photography also didn't find any evidence for tempera or watercolor paintings, which is what the red ochre pigment is. And then Fourier transform infrared spectra on the shroud fibers, specifically on the pure body image samples, showed none of the characteristic amide bands of the proteinous material. Again, that binder that the pigments needed to be in was not found present in the blood and the serum fibers of the Shroud of Turin. Okay. We have some other tests, such as a laser microprobe Raman spectrograph. Neither the presence of any inorganic substances or any foreign material was found, not even in residual amounts with this test. So think about it, right? So the Shroud skeptic, Walter McCrone, he's aware that it's kind of foolish. So at one point he kind of said, well, maybe through wear and tear over the centuries, all the paint has largely fallen off or oxidized off from the cloth. Or some skeptics like Hugh Ferry try to say, oh, well, the pigments were washed off for some reason. But still, these tests there would have been some residual amounts left in the crevices of the threads and that sort of thing. We would still expect to find a lot more pigment than what we found, even if we grant it centuries of wear and tear, or even if it was washed off. I don't think you could get it so thoroughly off that these spectral tests wouldn't be picking up a lot more than what we find. Finally, Pine Creek Doug, here you go. Pyrolysis mass spectrometry. He kind of stuck it to me on the show when I was on Pine Creek Doug's thing about this test specifically. And off the top of my head, I didn't know the results of this test. Well, here it is. This is a highly sensitive, although it's a destructive method, but this was used to detect small amounts of non-carbohydrate organic materials that could have been used in a painting substance, such as the ones Walter McCrone used. Guess what, Pine Creek? No contaminant was found on the image samples, neither pigment nor nitrogen-containing material like that would be found in the proteinous binder. So yeah, total failure on this front. We also have X-rays. X-ray absorption radiographs were used. Once again, these were used on the water stain images. But looking at the chest wound specifically, right? That's what it didn't register at all. If these were contained, made of paints, then this would register on the X-ray absorption radiographs. We would find presence of this vermilion and iron oxide pigments. And finally, and most importantly, with the spectral test is this X-ray fluorescence testing. These are used to find any metallic or inorganic elements with an atomic weight greater than 16. Guess what? Iron has an atomic weight greater than 16. It should have been finding it all over the place, and we didn't find it in the body images or the blood stain images. Now, as we're going to find out, remember, one of McCrone's findings is that, well, didn't you say that they did find iron and or iron oxide on the shroud? Absolutely. Using the X-ray fluorescence test, they did find this. But in their findings, it was found uniform in non-image areas and image areas combined. So really, the explanation for that is that this iron, as well as calcium and strontium, got onto the shroud during the retting process. And that's why we can explain the iron on the shroud. And it's important to remember there are three forms of iron, right? There's iron proper, there's iron oxide, which is relevant to the pigments. Those are more towards the bloodstains and the scorch marks and that sort of thing, where they were scorched over time. We also have iron heme in the bloodstains. Guess what? That's the same iron you find in blood. So that makes sense. Like I said, in terms of the iron on the shroud, this is something that could be used to support McCrone, but X-ray fluorescence has proven it's in uniform amounts, plus or minus a couple of degrees or something like that, all over the entire shroud. So this is not suggestive of a painting hypothesis where we would expect the iron oxide to only be found in the body and bloodstain images and not on the non-image areas of the cloth. Okay, so that's suggestive of the retting process. And you have various explanations for this iron oxide, like I said, and based on the X-ray fluorescence, it's more likely that it got on there due to the retting process than suggesting some kind of painting or pigment. Okay, so there's also the optical observations that Walter McCrone said. So this is what he saw when he looked through his microscope, that he was able to say, prove there was paints or pigments on there. Now, STIRP scientists John Heller and Al Adler, they also looked through the microscopes, and they said, we didn't find these particles. These are not found in any sufficient quantity to prove that the body and bloodstain images are composed of these substances. It's a flat out contradiction. Okay, so how do we make sense of that then? Well, essentially what Walter McCrone did is there are three main optical properties when you're looking at a particle under a microscope. So the first is that there is this thing called the refractive index, right? So this is the ratio of the velocity of light in a vacuum relative to the velocity of light in a medium, right? You're seeing, how does this particle reflect the light? There's also the issue of isotropy versus anisotropy. And that refers to substances that have one isotropy or more than one refractive indices. And there's also the issue of birefringence, which is the numerical difference between the maximum and minimum refractive indices of anisotropic substances. Okay, so that's the technical theory jargon out there. Why is this relevant to the shroud and whether it was painted? So Walter McCrone, he used his observations of these refractive indices to quote unquote prove that the blood stains were really paint. So essentially looking at the blood, blood is an isotropic material, right? So it just has that one refractive index. And it's not birefringent. It has a refractive index less than 1.6. McCrone said that he found in the bloodstain areas anisotropic material, and they had a birefringence above 2.5. Okay, so that's a contradiction then, right? So that's suggestive that it's paint and not blood then. But since different iron oxide pigments give different results under such tests, the true test to really find out what the composition of these particles was, what wasn't the birefringence or the isotropy versus anisotropy test, because you would get varying measures. It's also really important that McCrone claimed these refractive indices only on the basis of looking at a single shroud sample, shroud 3CB, and he looked at this under his microscope while it was still attached to the mylar backing tape. So obviously that's going to affect the refractive indices that you're getting, because it's not just going through the particle, the light, but it's also being affected by the mylar tape backing that it's still attached to. So this is just, McCrone was just a bumbler and an amateur scientist on this front, where he kind of messed up here. The STIRP scientists, on the other hand, removed the mylar backing tape, and guess what? Perfect, all consistent with real blood and not the pigments that McCrone was talking about. Yep, like I said, STIRP, on the other hand, even went beyond McCrone's tests, and they conducted other tests, such as the Beckline test, and they very clearly distinguished between the two different types of the red particles, some having refractive indices of 1.5 or more, others being consistent with blood, of having a much lower birefringence and refractive indices. In their own words, they said, quote unquote, there are clearly two very different kinds of red objects or globs on the shroud. And McCrone himself just totally missed this. Again, showing that he's kind of incompetent as a scientist. He didn't recognize there were a few contamination particles versus the majority of the red globs on the shroud had refractive indices less than 1.5, meaning they're blood, not paint. So this is just, in terms of the vermilion pigment, it's just a note here that Walter McCrone himself didn't know about this. He didn't discover this through his own looking through the microscope. It was his team later, using a spectral test, X-ray diffraction, that kind of discovered a single particle of vermilion paint on sample 3CB. And on that basis, McCrone said, oh, well, all of the bloodstains have been touched up with vermilion pigment. That's ridiculous. That's like saying, well, because we found insect parts on one sample of the shroud, that all of the body images are composed of insect parts and stuff like that. So yeah, it kind of shows Walter McCrone he was too hasty. He wasn't careful or scientific in the conclusions he did, or in the methodologies he employed. I mean, looking for the refractive indices of a particle still on the mylar backing tape is ridiculous. Like, you would be laughed at today if in scientific circles if you did that. So here's just what STIRP found in terms of the various particles that they looked at through the microscope and what they found. Again, nothing here contradicts that the shroud images were blood stains and or not composed of paint. And there's nothing here supportive of these images being composed of paint itself. Okay, what about chemical tests? And just so I know, any questions so far? I know this is technical and kind of boring and jargony and stuff, but how's it coming across, Stephanie, so far?
It's good. I just wanted to kind of sum up what you're saying. Is you're giving us multiple methods to show us that it's not paint that's on the shroud. It is the image of a man and the evidence that we have to support blood and other components that you would find in a man. Exactly.
Yeah. So, STIRP, they had various spectral tests. All of these physical spectral tests disconfirmed painting. None of them supported painting. They conducted various optical tests. Both sides conducted these optical tests. And STIRP went further than Walter McCrone. First of all, he had a flawed methodology. They disproved his claims, and they went further by conducting further tests all which supported that's not paint on the shroud. So, and now we're getting into the chemical tests that both sides did. Okay, so Heller and Adler conducted various microchemical tests, all of which confirmed that the inorganic paints or pigments that Walter McCrone claimed were present. They used high-powered microscopes, the same PLM microscope that he used, and they meticulously surveyed the shroud's image-bearing fibrils at different levels of high magnification, up to 1,000 times, using light polarization, phase contrast microscopes, and all of these came up with negative results for these paints or pigments. Now, what's more, the fibrils in the body image regions were proven to be completely uncoated with any foreign substances. And this was found because, again, remember, those joints of the threads themselves were still visible. There were no particles hidden in the crevices or the joints of the threads themselves. If it was painted, we would find massive evidence for that. They didn't find any of that when they conducted their microchemical tests. And additionally, Heller and Adler also conducted various microchemical experiments on the body image fibrils, and they found no organic components and that sort of thing either. Okay, well, what was there on the other side in terms of the chemical tests? So Walter McCrone, he conducted certain tests on the body image fibrils to see if there was proteins present. Because remember, there has to be that proteinous gelatin binder to hold the pigment. And Walter McCrone, he claimed that he had proven the existence of his gelatin paint medium containing detectable proteins within it. And what he used was this standard in forensics amido black test. And he got a positive result saying, look, there are proteins here. Therefore, it's a proteinous medium for a paint to be used as a paint binder. Now, McCrone himself, he admitted that the amido black test in and of itself is insufficient to prove one way or the other whether there's paint present or not. And because of this, he conducted a standard further test known as the PMA iodine sodium azide test. So this, again, very technical, I apologize, but he basically used that to determine that there were no cysteine or there was no cysteine present on the shroud's bloodstain images. And that was his way of eliminating that there was real human blood. If there's not human blood, then it's got to be paint. Now, the unfortunate thing here is McCrone used the wrong follow-up test. This test in and of itself, according to all world's experts, is inconclusive on its own front. So you can't determine whether it's paint or real blood based on this test alone. So Stirp, on the other hand, much more thorough than McCrone, they conducted a total of 8 different types of chemical tests using different reactants for protein detection. They used multiple control samples, whereas McCrone didn't use all of these. And this eliminated the inconclusiveness of McCrone's tests and proved conclusively these are not paints or pigments in the body and bloodstain images. So yeah, they conducted things like the fluorasamine test, and that proved that there was no paints, even at the nano to pictogram level. They all failed. Like, this is incredible. And one final chemical test that I think is important, if you think all of this is kind of mumbo jumbo, it's scientific jargon, here's the one thing that I would love you to know. This is the absolute falsification test, this proteasis test that proves conclusively, 100%, McCrone is wrong. These body images are not composed of paints. And it's this proteasis test that removed certain things and found that the fibrils were completely uncolored underneath the bloodstains and that sort of thing. They found that it was dissolved completely and quickly without any visible residue of the colored materials left present on the fibrils. This proteasis test is the absolute proof that the body images were not painted. Checkmate shroud skeptics at this point. So if you forget everything else I say, here's the one test that I'd love you to remember on the the chemical level that proves McCrone was wrong. Any questions so far? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that even what Slam is saying in there, she says one of the most convincing things is the way that nobody's been able to replicate this. So it just isn't, they can make hypotheses about painting. You've just shown us multiple ways that the painting has been debunked, but then you'll still get these people still insisting, oh, it's still painted. And you've shown it through lots and lots of different assessments. So the question is that obviously this brings forward is, how do you think the image got there?
Exactly. And that kind of brings me to I'm nearing the end now. So here's, okay, great. So I've kind of went over the minimal relevant features, and we've assessed how does the traditional painting hypothesis explain these features. It obviously fails them. And now we want to do our overall assessment, right? So in terms of the best explanation inference criteria, starting with plausibility, this is exactly what Slam, I think it was saying. Like, look, the notion of any artist prior to the 20th century coming up with the idea to paint an image in the negative that encodes three-dimensional information, also contains those vertically mapped wrapping distortions. In light of our scientifically proven knowledge about our limitations as human beings in terms of our hand-eye brain coordination, it's just sheer fantasy. It's totally implausible to believe that an artist could purposefully paint these features and or even get to them by pure happenstance, as Walter McCrone said. Even as a happy accident, it is wholly implausible to think that these just happened by pure coincidence. Also, it's totally unique, as Slam was saying, right? No other painting in human history is comparable to the Shroud. Nothing has these same features or images. The Shroud is entirely unique in terms of its having all of these minimal relevant features. That makes it implausible, I would say. Mm-hmm. Also, the body images are barely visible at close range. There's this image diffuseness. So think of that would mean in order to see it, the Shroud images, you have to stand back from it about 4 to 6 feet or so, I think it is. So that would mean what? An artist, did they have like a gigantic paintbrush standing back 4 to 6 feet and painting the images just to be able to see their own work? Come on now. No, that's ridiculous. And even medieval art historians like Thomas de Westlow, who's an agnostic, he's not a Christian, even he says there are no known precedents for such an artistic technique. In terms of explanatory scope and power, we just spent the last hour going over that. You saw it fails multiple things. It fails superficiality, body image uniformity, the three-dimensional features, vertically mapped, and it also fails the fact that there is no paint. The images are not composed of paint. Finally, on the less ad hoc criterion, I think Alan Adler said it great in his 1986 presentation. Look, with all of the tests, the chemical, spectral, and optical tests that Stirp did in comparison to Walter McCrone, maybe it's possible a skeptic could come up with some kind of counter to explain away the results of any individual test. But in order to explain away them cumulatively, you would need about a dozen such different compounds in order to explain what he can with simply one compound, saying that it's the bloodstains are composed of real blood. That explains all the tests. That's consistent with all of these myriad of tests, and that the body images are not composed of paint, but dehydrated cellulose and oxidized cellulose. And that's the difference with how science works, right? You can try to pose 12 to 15 different compounds and put that up against the far simpler thing. No, it's blood, and there's no paint on the body images. It's made of oxidized cellulose. That is what would get published in the peer-reviewed journals. That's what did get published in the peer-reviewed journals. Whereas Walter McCrone, with his painting stuff, he published it in the Microscope. He was the editor of that journal. That's cheating. That's not peer review. That's saying, hey, I own this journal. I'm going to publish my BS in it, and no one's going to peer review it. Whereas Al Adler and Hedler's, their results are in things like applied optics and stuff like that, or secular forensic journals that they have nothing to do with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I know who I believe. I believe Adler and Heller well over Walter McCrone.
Yeah, and I want to point out a couple of things just to add to what you're saying. But I think like Captive Death seems to think that all of these people, there's a big conspiracy going on, and all of these people are fibbing. These serious scientists are just fibbing because they want to piece together a story. But you have somebody like Roy Rogers, who came to the Shroud, or Ray Rogers, I should say, came to the Shroud as a skeptic, didn't believe at first that it was the authentic Shroud of Turin of Jesus Christ. And then after serious investigation and a lot of different scientific tests, he realized that he was wrong. And so he made that claim. And so Susan's been pointing that out, along with Joe Marino's book that looked at the carbon dating. But I wanted to ask you a question that Captive Death keeps bringing up. Mm-hmm. It's my understanding from Joe Marino, and I also have read the book that Susan referenced. It's my understanding from him that there was a piece of the Shroud that was taken, and it was split up between, I believe, 3 different places. Everyone was looking at it. They carbon dated it, but they had to destroy the piece that was carbon dated, because that's how the carbon dating process works. You destroy this piece. But they had retained, it's my understanding, according to Joe and to others, they had retained some other pieces, like they retained pieces around this area, and that's what they've been doing the tests on. So that's my understanding from what you're saying is where these tests are coming from. But is that what you're saying, that the tests are coming from some of the original material that had been pulled by Stirp?
Yeah, like the tests that I was mentioning in this presentation were done by Stirp. These are the tests that were done from 1978 to 1981, when they actually observed the cloth. This is before the carbon dating. This is from all over the cloth, not just where the carbon dating sample was found, but
okay.
Yeah, like this is from various areas throughout the Shroud. It's pointing the spectral tests at the entire Shroud itself. So yeah, I don't think
that's great. So you cleared up a lot right there. So
yeah,
that's really good. So we know, so they had access back at that time. And these were people that included like Barry Schwartz, as you had on your channel, who's, I think he's Jewish. He doesn't believe in Jesus Christ, but a lot of them do believe that this is the body, the authentic body of Jesus Christ. And so, and to me, I should point out too, that you don't have to necessarily believe in the Shroud to be a Christian. I mean, you could be a Christian and not necessarily believe in the Shroud. This isn't something that you have. And I used to be a Christian who believed what came out in the 1980s about this carbon dating, and I had it looked into it. And it was about, I think, a couple of years ago that I decided I would just take an honest look at the academic articles published on it and aside for myself. And doing that led me to believe that the Shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree that, look, you don't have to believe in the Shroud to be a Christian. That's not an essential doctrine or belief and stuff like that. But I think the evidence is compelling, and the more the merrier. Why would you want to be closed-minded to using evidence that could potentially persuade someone? I mean, look, we hear the atheists and skeptics all the time. Why doesn't God give me scientific proof? Here it is. Shut up and look at it. Here it is. You've got it, right? So, yeah, it's definitely not something you have to believe in. If it turns out to be false, let's say I've been talking nonsense and I find out the Shroud is a fake someday, I'm still going to be a Christian. That's not going to affect my Christianity because I've got other evidence as to why I believe. So, yeah, I totally agree with that. And you're bang on about Ray Rogers too. I will give him credit. He disagrees with what I'm seeing in this president. He disagreed with Adler and Heller, right? He had his own notion, and he's totally against radiation and a supernatural type mechanism and that sort of thing. He went more for a Maillard reaction. So yeah, there's no conspiracy. I mean, Rogers and stuff, he had his own scientific integrity. They disagreed with each other on certain things, but they agree on what has been proven beyond reasonable doubt, that thing is not painted. There is no paint on the Shroud images, and that's proven beyond all reasonable doubt. And that's why Adler, Rogers, we're all on the same side on that front, despite us having differences of opinion on other secondary matters and stuff like that. So yeah, to claim that there's a conspiracy with the 26 secular scientific peer-reviewed journals, were they all biased? They had nothing to do with the Shroud. They didn't know, or Applied Optics didn't know or care. They weren't Christians. They were just scientists in some of the most prestigious science journals in existence. Whereas on the other hand, you've got McCrone publishing in The Microscope, the journal that he owned. And by the way, even the McCrone Institute, his own institute, has renounced McCrone and his findings. They've taken down his peer-reviewed papers that he published back in the 80s because they were such garbage science. They don't want those posted up on the McCrone Institute website anymore. So I think it's fairly obvious who's more credible on that front. The last thing I'll just say about the less ad hoc. Now, remember that proteinous binder, gelatin binder that I was talking about that had proteins in it and stuff for the pigment? Now, McCrone knew that because of the way the body images are, he had to speculate that this gelatin binder was heavily diluted. It was only 0.01% iron oxide pigment in a 0.01% gelatin binding medium solution. And that was the only way. Essentially, it's just water that he's proposing here for what this artist used his paintbrush to paint on the shroud to create the body images. That was the only way he could explain these facts. But this is incredibly ad hoc. In the first place, there's no historical evidence, and it's quite frankly ridiculous to suppose that a medieval artist would use such a heavily diluted solution that had never been heard of either before, during, or after by anyone else. But some medieval genius of an artist, for no good reason, used this diluted mixture just to explain what we have with the shroud's images being, so faint. No evidence for these heavy applications of paint that every other paintwork has. And Walter McCrone himself readily admits all other paintings typically have at least a 1 millimeter or more thick paint layer on them. And you can detect two-dimensional brush strokes. What direction was he, vertically or horizontally or diagonally, when he was using the paintbrush? The shroud is unique, and that's why he has to come up with this ad hoc, non-evidenced assumption that, well, maybe the medieval artist of the shroud came up with this heavily diluted mixture. There's no proof for that, and it's historically implausible that would ever take place. So that's it on my presentation. So
yeah, well, good job. I really appreciate your presentation. I think you did a great job, and you went into a lot of details. I want to say hi to all the people in the chat who've been conversing. So I see Captive Desk and Harry Stark and Slam RN. Earlier I saw Father John Brown, and so I'd love to have any of them back on the channel. It's always wonderful to have you on the channel. And so you were telling me before we go, that in a few weeks we might be able to have one of your other friends or associates on the channel to talk about that. Did you want to mention that just in case we were able to get that worked out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've touched base with my friend Larry Stolley, we're going to be switching to a historical topic, but specifically the New Testament, the Bible. So he's an expert on the biblical mentions of the shroud images. So I'm going to be asking him first, what are some of the shroud skeptical things? John 20, Isaiah 53. What are some of the biblical reasons to rule out the shroud? But also, what are the 3 or 4 texts that he wants to talk about that prove that they knew about the shroud images in the first century, in biblical times? Things like Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. So that'll be the topic of the series next time and stuff. A lot less technical and boring as this one. So yeah.
Well, no, I think sometimes you have to be technical to explain things to people if you're going to be able to debunk them. So The bottom line is that the shroud is not a painting.
Exactly.
And Dale showed us numerous reasons to indicate that the shroud is not a painting. So now you skeptics have to figure out exactly how that image appeared there. And so how did it get there? And how is it that until we had that photograph from around 1898, people didn't even realize how impressive the shroud is as far as the face of Jesus Christ and the body of Jesus Christ and the marks. I mean, the problem with the shroud, or the really amazing thing that's so sad, is over 100 whippings. I mean, he was just absolutely brutalized, which is so sad. And so he just, what he did for our sins and our salvation is beautiful. And all we should do is just thank him. That's the very least.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's like 130 or something like that. I remember reading on one of the sides. Just, I don't know how he did it, but yeah, it's just out of pure love for us and stuff. That got him through it and stuff. And I can't imagine going through that myself. So
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing, and all that kind of good stuff. So those of you who are questioning Christianity, or you're skeptical of Christianity, like Captive Desk, uh, think through what Jesus did for you. He did it for all of us. Whether you're a believer now or you're not a believer, there's no reason that you can't come to Christianity, come to Jesus. So,
I will say, it looks like Captive Desk agrees with us, right? Like he's saying, I agree, it's not a painting. That's it, full stop. It's not from a brush. So this is one thing I should have mentioned. Look, every shroud skeptic in the world today, living today, disagrees with Walter McCrone. That's not a painting. I had Hugh Ferry, probably the most knowledgeable shroud skeptic, on my show, and he admits, look, McCrone was wrong. This isn't a painting. So it's nobody except for people like Pine Creek Doug who still believe this nonsense. Yeah, no one informed believes it, whether skeptic or not.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So Dale, what are you working on now? I know you're working on lots of shroud stuff, but what can people expect to, if they go over to your channel, you guys make sure you go subscribe to Dale's channel. It's called Real Seekers. And it's so funny because I'm so familiar with boats that when I first see that, sometimes I'm inclined to write REEL, thinking of a fishing reel, because boats always have catchy names. And so it's
You
so
know
funny.
what? I had an atheist when I was on Skeptics and Seekers, and I just started Real Seekers. They're like, "Oh, you could have been so much clever because you're a fisher of men, like real REEL Seekers." And so I was like, "Oh, I didn't think of that, but yeah, that would have been clever." So.
Yeah, that's what I think. I think of in terms of boats a lot, but what are they? Where are they going to find you?
Yeah. Where? On YouTube or Rumble Video, I'm Real Seekers, plural with an S, or on my blog page, it's Real Seeker Ministries at .wordpress.com.
Hmm.
So that one's not plural. Real
Well, I'll have to
Seeker.
go to that. I don't think I've even subscribed to your Real Seekers at WordPress, because I have a WordPress account too. So yeah, we'll definitely have to get over there. Yeah, and thank you. Harry Stark is posting your channel here, so we can make sure to get over there and join it. And that's great. And so we'll have you on again. We might have you on with a special guest next
Yep.
time to talk about the Bible and the evidence for the shroud in the Bible, which is really interesting stuff. And we're talking about that a little bit today. And then we'll come back and talk about some other evidence for the shroud in the future. So yes,
Awesome.
thank you. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.
Sounds good.
So I will end the stream.
All right.
It's actually right there at an hour.